But first tonight, an under-pressure Prime Minister has snapped while being grilled about plans to change negative gearing and capital gains tax. After facing scrutiny all day, Albanese this afternoon lost his cool in a heated interview. He admitted he had no idea whether his Treasurer had requested modelling on changes to the controversial tax policies. Here he was on ABC Radio with Richard Glover this afternoon.
The department, like all departments, look at various things at various times. So is this government policy or government request to examine potential policy announcement? No, it's not.
But it's a fair question to ask you whether you or your Treasurer has requested this study.
Sure, and I've answered that.
You've answered it for yourself, but not for the Treasurer.
Well, I'm not the Treasurer.
But you must have said to, hey, Jim, did you ask them to do this?
No, not at all.
So sorry, you don't know whether your Treasurer has asked them to do this work or not?
Well, I don't know because I'm not the Treasurer, and the Treasurer is on his way to China as we speak. But what we have done is to concentrate on our Homes for Australia plan.
So he doesn't know whether his own government is re-examining negative gearing policy. That was a Trainwreck interview, and that is what a Prime Minister under pressure looks like. And he's certainly feeling the heat. Along with bad polls, there are now even calls within Labor for his removal as PM. Senior Labor figure, former Queensland State Secretary Cameron Milner, wrote a public article saying that it was time for the Labor Party to take the nuclear option and force Albanese's exit. Milner writes that Albanese criticises the extreme Greens, but his only viable plan to remain PM will see him govern with the extreme Greens. Labor simply can't let him do that to our party. So to re-energise the base, lift the Labor primary and put it in a position to win a second term in office, they need to take the nuclear option. Albanese has tried his best, but his best isn't good enough. Well, with concern growing about Albanese's ability to lead the country, it's likely we're going to see more of his temper, more of him losing his cool over the next few months ahead of the election. The Prime Minister is frustrated that pesky journalists keep asking questions about tax policy, questions that are clearly in the public interest, questions that are legitimate given Labor's flip-flopping on policies like negative gearing over the years. The reality is Labor is obsessed with class warfare and as such has always despised negative gearing. Ahead of the 2019 election, Labor promised to scrap it.
You've invested under current tax laws. They're the rules that will apply going forward. Our changes to negative gearing are prospective.
This is the most generous property tax concession in the world, in effect. Very few countries do it.
And Albanese mounted the case himself as well, saying that scrapping negative gearing was a priority, his word, priority, you'll hear it in a minute, and the right thing to do. Here he was, making those remarks on both the Today Show and on Sky News ahead of the 2019 election.
Well, we've outlined, Lisa, our policies, including the quite controversial policy, according to Christopher, of doing something about housing affordability, for example, in terms of changes that we would make to negative gearing and to capital gains in terms of those concessions. That's pretty brave for an opposition to do, but it's the right thing to do.
Negative gearing policy, I see that there's another report that's come out claiming that it will put downward pressure on house prices. That's what Labor wants, though, isn't it? For it to put downward pressure on house prices. That's the purpose.
Well, I think what it will clearly do is mean that the increase in housing prices will be less than they would have been without this. And I believe it's a strong policy.
That election was considered unlosable for Bill Shorten. Yet lose it he did, thanks to voters roundly rejecting tax changes like on capital gains and negative gearing. Because it turned out that it wasn't only the wealthy who had investment properties. Many Australians do. And it would have been a hit to the hip pocket for 1.2 million voters. That's how many people negatively gear their properties. Well, in the wake of Bill Shorten's crushing loss, Albanese seized the Labor leadership and dumped the party's radical tax plans. And suddenly, he was arguing there'd be no change to negative gearing.
Gearing now a good thing?
With our Help to Buy scheme. Negative gearing is a good thing.
But it wasn't 3 years ago.
Negative gearing, we had a policy that we took to the election where we were not successful.
Why was negative gearing and capital gains tax breaks a bad idea in 2019 and a good idea in 2022?
Well, we've found a better idea, a range of them.
But now it seems this may be another broken promise, because we learned today that Treasury is examining options to change negative gearing. The Herald reporting that federal officials have started work on options to scale back negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, preparing the ground for a bold new housing policy that could define the federal election. They report that a request for modelling on the potential change to negative gearing has been made, and that it could canvass changes to the concessions on capital gains tax. Well, when asked about this explosive report today, the Prime Minister didn't deny it.
I've seen those reports, and what we do is we value the public service. So from time to time, I'm sure the public service are looking at policy ideas.
But then by this afternoon, his message was confused, and he all but admitted he had no idea if his Treasurer or anyone else in his government was re-examining negative gearing. In the past week, the Prime Minister was asked several times if he was looking at changes to this policy, and he was annoyed at the ABC for even asking.
Are you saying negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions are absolutely off the table for you?
Well, they're tax policies.
Yeah, but are those tax policies, are those tax policies completely off the table for you?
Well, Patricia, I don't answer the sort of those sort of questions.
In another ABC radio interview, Albanese seemed to rule out changes.
One analysis is certainly the Property Council argued that would have a negative impact on supply. So that is one of the reasons why we're very cautious about that.
So at the same time Albanese was all but ruling out negative gearing changes, Treasury was reportedly looking at options to do precisely that. It's incredible how loose he is with his word, ruling it out at the same time as his government considers major change. This is misleading to the public, and it says a lot about Albanese's character. He's already once lied about the changes to Stage 3 tax cuts. As you know, he pledged over and over again that he wouldn't touch them until the day he changed them dramatically. Now, clearly, Albanese is worried about the Greens taking votes off Labor thanks to the perception that they care more about the housing crisis. But if he does go ahead with this broken promise, it would unleash a world of political pain on Albanese. Peter Dutton's Liberal campaign team is already thinking about reprising this advert from the Shorten era.
Bill Shorten's new housing tax would take a wrecking ball to the economy. Some experts believe it could even lead to a recession. With their higher capital gains taxes and ending negative gearing as we know it, Labor would cut the value of your home and push up rents. A softer housing market means now is the worst time for Labor's housing tax. Labor can't manage money. That's why they're coming after yours. Labor, it's the bill Australia can't afford.
Yep, that would be a scare campaign, but the reality is that changes to negative gearing would have two immediate consequences that would be detrimental to our economy and the housing market. It could lead to a collapse in house prices, and it would decrease the value of people's own homes. And secondly, it wouldn't help renters because rents inevitably would go up. In terms of the hit to the hip pocket for families, it'd be massive. And the budget revenue wouldn't be immediate because the scheme would have to be grandfathered. This debate and uncertainty over tax policy comes at a time when the Australian economy is already stagnant. But there was good news today that inflation has come down dramatically. Headline inflation has fallen to 2.7% last month, while underlying inflation fell from 3.8% to 3.4%. And this was welcomed by the Treasurer.
The new inflation numbers for August showed that headline and underlying inflation both went down substantially. These are very welcome, very encouraging and very heartening numbers.
RBA Governor Michelle Bullock made the point this week that headline inflation has been driven down temporarily by the government's energy rebate, and this will rise again by around 0.5 percentage point when the rebate ends. The RBA isn't expecting inflation to return to the target band until late next year, and Michelle Bullock doesn't expect it'll be at a sustainable level until mid-2026.
I think the point I would make is that if tomorrow we get an inflation number which has got a 2 in front of it, so it's back in the band, that doesn't mean that we've got inflation under control. It doesn't mean that inflation is sustainably back within the band. It just means it's back there at the moment.
And in the media, there's been criticism today of the Treasurer for artificially or temporarily lowering inflation. But the point is this: Jim Chalmers was trying to find a way to provide cost of living relief without contributing to inflation. Any cash handout would certainly have been inflationary. Energy rebates were quite a genius way to offer relief, and the beauty of it was that, yes, it temporarily reduced inflation. But as the RBA governor said, inflation is persistent, it is sticky, and this means there won't be a rate cut anytime soon, and possibly not before the federal election. And you can bet that if there's no rate cut, Albanese will point the blame at his treasurer. Political editor Simon Benson writes that, ironically, to guarantee inflation and rates come down would require the government to do the exact opposite of what it's doing, spending. And with an election campaign to think of, the government is hardly likely to do that. And that's the catch. The Treasurer has managed to mostly stop his radical and ambitious colleagues from going on a massive spendathon in their own portfolios. That's notwithstanding the $82 million Penny Wong has given to the terrorist-controlled Gaza. But with the election coming up, it's not clear how long he'll be able to hold them off, with Labor MPs clearly caring more about staying in office than bringing down the cost of living.